Here we go. This is session number 28. Nice. All right. This is still chapter 4. We're on page 62 in the text. Section 4, IV, for you Roman nurses out there. All right. Section 4, it's called This Need Not Be. Very interesting section. All right, because once again, this is a chapter that's called The Illusions of the Ego. All right, and it's an early chapter, and it's the beginnings of Jesus, really getting into the descriptions of the ego, which will continue, till chapter 30. Okay, so this is called This Need Not Be. If you cannot hear the voice for God, it is because you do not choose to listen. That you do listen to the voice of your ego is demonstrated by your attitudes, your feelings, and your behavior. Yet this is what you want. This is what you are fighting to keep and what you are vigilant to save. Your mind is filled with schemes to save the face of your ego, and you do not seek the face of Christ. The glass in which the ego seeks to see its face is dark indeed. How can it maintain the trick of its existence except with mirrors? But where you look to find yourself is up to you. All right? So, it's pretty clear, right? No Shakespearean cadence or multisyllabic words or triple negatives or anything. All right, he's simply saying if you cannot hear the voice for God, it's because you do not choose to listen. Right? And there's a play on the sentence they used to say, many are called, few are chosen. That's what we used to hear as young children. But Jesus tweaks it, and he goes, all are called, few choose to listen. All right, so this is what he's saying. If you're not hearing the voice for God, it's because you choose not to listen. All right. He says that you do listen to the voice of your ego is clearly demonstrated. Right? And it's demonstrated by your attitudes, right? Your feelings, your behavior. He says, this is what you want. All right. And this is, once again, what he said to Helen Schuckman. He goes, you're just far too tolerant of your mind wandering into the ego thought system and identifying with it. All right. Because once the decision maker in the mind decides to align itself with the thought of separation, that thought of individuality, all right, it becomes this ego thought system. It takes it on. All right. He says, and your mind is filled with schemes to save it. The ego does all kinds of things to prove itself real. Right? And we defend the ego. He says, but where you look to find yourself is up to you. All right, it's the decision maker, and the decision-making part of your mind. All right, it's like, who do you want to be? All right, where do you look to find who you really are in the world of separation, conflict, chaos? Sin, guilt, and fear, right? Or the condition of oneness. Right? In paragraph 2, I have said that you cannot change your mind by changing your behavior. But I have also said, and many times, that you can change your mind. When your mood tells you that you have chosen wrongly, and this is so whenever you are not joyous, then no, this need not be. All right. In every case, you have thought wrongly about some brother God created, and are perceiving images your ego makes in a darkened glass. Think honestly what you have thought that God would not have thought, and what you have not thought that God would have you think. Search sincerely for what you have done and left undone accordingly, and then change your mind to think with God's. This may seem hard to do, but it is much easier than trying to think against it. Your mind is one with God's. Denying this and thinking otherwise has held your ego together, but has literally split your mind. As a loving brother, I am deeply concerned with your mind and urge you to follow my example as you look at yourself and at your brother and see in both the glorious creations of a glorious Father. Okay? So, he says you can change your mind. All right? Changing behavior doesn't really change your mind. All right? Although we know from experience here that if the behavior is really, outrageous and detrimental, it might be a good idea to stop doing whatever you're doing, in regards to addictions, so to speak. Changing that behavior might be beneficial and open the door to changing the mind. Because so many times addiction is, it creates such an intense fog that it's hard to see correctly. It's hard to hear the voice for God. All right? It's hard to hear the Holy Spirit. All right? So it might be a good idea to change that behavior. All right? As a portal to changing the mind. All right? And when he says your mood tells you that you have chosen wrongly, remember, this doesn't have to be this way. This need not be. All right? And when he says that, he just generalizes it. And he says, when your mood shows you that you have chosen to align yourself with the ego thought system. Oh, what mood is that? He says, anything that's not joyous. So if you're not joyous walking down the street, just happy, right? Happy as a tree, all right? Happy as a clam, they used to say. If you're not walking down the street in a joyous mood, then you've chosen to align yourself with the ego. And he says, and it doesn't have to be that way. You can get back. You can change your mind, right? So he says, in every case, you have thought wrongly about some brother God created and are perceiving images your ego makes in a darkened glass. So, especially when we look upon an other and we see that brother, all right, and we start making judgments and projecting guilt onto this person. He says that, God created that brother, all right? And what you're doing is perceiving images that the ego made in that darkened glass, all right? So he says, and Jesus is always telling us to take our, spiritual inventory here. He says, look, think honestly what you have thought that God would not think. So that's a very nice poetic way of saying, take your own inventory and look at what you're thinking. Don't repress it. Don't say, oh, no, it's not me. I'm a spiritual person. I don't think that way about people. But we do. All right? And he's not going to punish us for thinking that way. He's going to tell you that's what happens when you're aligned with the ego. This is what else do egos do? They point out the guilt in other parties. You know, they point out the guilt in everything. They separate. Egos keep separating, right? They build walls around the community, right? So he says, think honestly what you thought that God would not have thought, right? Search sincerely for what you have done and left undone accordingly, and then change your mind to think with God's. You know, that's the basic. It makes it sound very simple. You know, what am I doing? Why do I feel angry? Why do I feel nervous? Why do I feel, you know, upset about this? I'm not happy. All right? You've aligned yourself with the ego. You're listening to the wrong teacher. So the step is to say, oh, I don't want that. You know, I'd rather be happy. And we go to our higher self. We go to the right mind, where the memory of ourselves, true selves, resides, all right, in the form of Jesus and Holy Spirit. And we ask, help me to see this correctly. I'm willing to be corrected here. I don't want the unhappiness anymore. I don't want the fear. Okay. And he says, it's much easier than trying to think against God's mind. Think with the mind of God. It's a lot easier than thinking against it. All right? Your mind is one with God's. All right? So it's much easier to align yourself with that. All right? Denying this and thinking otherwise has held your ego together. You know, and the ego will tell you, will tell you, no, you're being pretty arrogant. Your mind is one with God's, you know, you must be crazy. You know, there's places for you. How could you think that way? That's so arrogant. But he's telling us over and over again, that's the truth. Your mind is one with God's. And if you deny this, that's what holds the ego together. And he says, but that has also split your mind. All right? The one mind. Once the one mind entertained the tiny mad idea, as they say, the mind split. Then we had to make a choice. Okay? And we constantly make that choice. All right? And we're constantly making that choice until we realize, oh, it just feels a lot better aligning myself with God's mind. It just feels better, right? Until sooner or later we can say the ultimate no to the ego. I don't want any part of it, all right? And for us in this condition, it takes practice, right? Like getting to Carnegie Hall, right? It takes practice, practice, practice. All righty then. So, Jesus says, as a loving brother, I am deeply concerned with your mind, and I urge you to follow my example as you look at yourself and at your brother, right? And see in both the glorious creations of a glorious Father. Right? So he says, I'm concerned about your mind. And I want you to, look at you and look at your brother and see that glorious creation instead of what the ego tells us. All right? So, in paragraph 3, when you are sad, know this need not be. Depression comes from a sense of being deprived of something you want and do not have. remember that you are deprived of nothing except by your own decisions, and then decide otherwise. All right? So that mood, the sadness, when we feel sad, feel depressed, he says it's a sense of being deprived of something that you want. All right? And he says, but look at that and just go to your right mind, where the memory it resides, that you are deprived of nothing. Right? You are deprived of nothing except by your own decisions. The only thing that deprives me of everything is my decision for separation, to believe that I could separate. We don't really separate, but we believe it, and the mind is so powerful that believing is seeing. All right. So when we believe we've separated from everything, it's you get these waves of depression, like, oh, I have nothing. He says, remember that you're deprived of nothing except by your own decisions, and then decide otherwise. You decide, okay, Jesus, help me to see this correctly. Help me to see this sad situation correctly. All right, so when you're sad, know that this need not be. Paragraph 4, when you are anxious, realize that anxiety comes from the capriciousness of the ego. And know this need not be. You can be as vigilant against the ego's dictates as for them. All right? So the ego, it's capricious. It wants one thing one day, it wants another thing another day. Safety is over here. No, it's over here. Your happiness is here. No, it's here. It's very unsteady, very inconsistent. All right? And it causes us to feel, as my wonderful wife Jean would say, makes you feel like a shook up bottle of soda. All right? Like that's all that carbonation inside just waiting to burst somewhere. All right? Just waiting to slip out sideways somewhere. So when you're anxious, all right, he says that comes from the ego, from the inconsistency, the capriciousness of the ego. All right, flitting from one thing to the other like a shrew. All right? And when you feel guilty, all right, remember the ego has indeed violated the laws of God. But you have not. The ego has violated the laws of God. The ego thinks it's separate and individual. And it's dog eat dog, and I got to get mine. I got to stop using that expression. I don't like it. It's an old expression. But that's the ego thought system. I got to get mine, right? Somebody's out to get it, all right? So because I've separated from abundance, where I have everything, I have no need to get yours. All right? But he says the ego can violate the laws of God, but you have not. Right? You, who you truly are, has not violated the laws of God. That's what Jesus does throughout this whole course, is he slips in what we call the atonement principle. Right? You have not separated. You are innocent as the day God thought of you. Right? You are innocent as the day that you expanded from the mind of God. Right? You have not violated God's laws. He says, leave the sins of the ego to me. All right? That's what atonement is for, he says. That is what the atonement is for. But until you change your mind about those whom your ego has hurt, the atonement cannot release you. While you feel guilty, your ego is in command. But only the ego can experience guilt, and this need not be. All right? So only the ego experiences guilt. All right? And when we're aligned with the ego, we feel the guilt and repress it. And as the famous Mr. Freud would say, what we repress, we project. We throw it forward, all right, onto you. It's you, right? I'm not the guilty one. I'm going to find reasons why you're guilty. So those are the other people that the ego has hurt. We keep them guilty. We keep them separated from love, right? Not me, okay. All right. But until you change your mind about them, the atonement cannot release you. It doesn't just release me. The innocence just doesn't release me. It has to release everybody. It has to include everyone. So I like to use the word happy because it's a good way to look at it. It's like, I want my innocence, all right? And if I was innocent, I would be joyous. I would be happy, right? So I go and I ask Jesus, help me to be joyous. Help me to be happy. And I'm willing to let everyone else be happy too. Because what if everybody was happy? All right? There'd be nobody cutting in line in front of you at the grocery store. Or even if they did, no problem. Hey, we're all happy anyway. Right? You realize it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. No one would be that competitive. Right? Everybody's just happy. We know we have everything. Right? So why not wish for that for everyone? Why not be willing to see everyone as innocent and joyous? Right? And what we remember is that I don't perceive your innocence. I don't make it up, I ask to become aware of your innocence, all right? As you practice these things in the Course, you'll see that slight important difference, all right? I don't whitewash over anybody's stuff, well, he's just doing that because he thinks he's separated from God. Oh, that's okay, we'll forgive him. You gotta be careful, all right? I just want to ask, help me to see the situation correctly. All right, I'm willing to see everyone's innocence. All right, that's what he's talking about, to see the face of Christ in everyone here. And he says, leave the sins to me. All right, that's what the atonement is for. All right, that's what the idea of innocence is for. If you ask me to experience and become aware of your own innocence, and you're willing to see the other's innocence, you're willing for the atonement principle to arise, and that takes care of the sins. He says, let me take care of that for you. Right? But until you change your mind about those whom your ego has hurt, the atonement cannot release you. All right? You can't be free if you're keeping somebody else a prisoner. Okay? While you feel guilty, your ego is in command, because only the ego can experience guilt. All right? Your true self cannot experience guilt. It does not exist. It only comes into existence when I decide that I've separated from my source. I've separated from God. I am outside the mind of God. All right? Then I experience the guilt. Oh, what did I do? You know, like Adam and Eve heading for the trees. Hurry up. Grab that fig leaf. Hurry up, he's coming. Okay. So he says, remember, this need not be. All right? And in the paragraph before, a sentence I neglected to focus on, but he's going to say it again in paragraph 6. Excuse me. He says, you can be as vigilant against the ego's dictates as for them. All right? Which means we can be vigilant to know when we've moved into that alignment with the ego thought system. All right? With, mindfulness, as the word goes, you can realize, I'm not feeling too happy, right? You've gone into the ego thought system. And he says that's being vigilant, saying, oh, that's the ego. Right? He says you could be just as vigilant, right, for the ego's dictates as for them, because the ego would, take it steps further than, no, you don't feel good, it's because of them. All right, so in paragraph 6, he says, watch your mind for the temptations of the ego, and do not be deceived by it. Right? It offers you nothing. Right? When you have given up this voluntary dispiriting, you will see how your mind can focus and rise above fatigue and heal. Yet you are not sufficiently vigilant against the demands of the ego to disengage yourself. This need not be. Right? He says you're not sufficiently vigilant against the demands of the ego to disengage yourself. Right? And in this section, he uses that word dispirited. All right, so you've moved out of spirit, which is your true existence. You are spirit, right? You are the abstract, right? Happy is an abstract spirit, okay? And he says, but when you're dispirited, it's voluntary. I've made the choice. I volunteered to believe I'm separated, all right? And he says, and so you're not sufficiently vigilant against the ego. And that's just another way of the message that he gave to Alan Shuckman when he told us is you're much too tolerant of mind wandering. Right? You don't focus. Right? You just let your mind wander, and the next thing you know, it's in the ego thought system. Right? I think I used this example once before, and I guess it's basically for the senior citizens who used to drive cars that would occasionally go out of alignment. You hit enough potholes, enough bumpy roads, you hit a curb or two trying to park, and the alignment would be out, and your car would drift. If you didn't hold on to that steering wheel, your car would drift. All right? And if you weren't paying too much attention, all of a sudden the car would be drifting to the left or the right. You have to steer it back into the lane. All right? So that's what happens to the mind. It drifts. And it will naturally drift into the ego because that's what it's most familiar with at this point. All right? It's most familiar with that, even though it's the land of chaos.